We associate chocolate with childhood innocence and sweet indulgence. But there is something deeply unsettling when this harmless treat becomes a calculated weapon. Imagine a pristine seaside holiday in the late 19th century. A 4-year-old boy is handed a chocolate cream from a highly reputable confectioner. Minutes after taking a bite, he is dead. Authorities initially assumed it was a tragic industrial accident. It was only later that investigators uncovered a far more sinister truth, a twisted web of unrequited love, madness, and poisoned candy. Welcome to the terrifying case of the chocolate cream killer. June 12, 1871, dawned as a perfectly idyllic day on the southern coast of England. At the time, Brighton was the premier seaside resort for wealthy Londoners, a fashionable escape filled with grand promenades, fresh ocean air, and elegant society. It was the absolute pinnacle of Victorian leisure, a place where affluent families retreated to escape the smog and grime of the industrial city. Among the seasonal visitors seeking a peaceful summer holiday were the Barkers, a respectable family who had travelled down to the coast to enjoy the restorative climate. Accompanying them was their 4-year-old son, Sidney Albert Barker. He was a vibrant, healthy child, completely unaware that his family's pleasant vacation was about to become the epicenter of a terrifying public health crisis that would shock the entire nation. Like any young boy on holiday, Sidney was treated to a special indulgence. The family procured a box of sweets from J.G. Maynard's, one of Brighton's most highly respected local confectioners. Located in the bustling, affluent heart of the town, Maynard's shop was renowned for its exquisite pastries and delicately crafted candies, particularly its widely popular chocolate creams. These bite-sized treats, featuring a rich cocoa shell surrounding a soft fondant center, were a staple of Victorian high society and a symbol of innocent luxury. There was absolutely no reason for the Barker family to suspect that the elegant confectionery they handed to young Sidney harbored a lethal, invisible secret beneath its sweet exterior. Shortly after consuming a chocolate cream, the child's joyful holiday demeanor vanished. The onset of his symptoms was sudden, violent, and highly unnatural. Sidney began to complain of a sharp, bitter metallic taste, which was quickly followed by a terrifying rigidity seizing his small muscles. He had inadvertently ingested a lethal dose of strychnine, a highly toxic alkaloid traditionally utilized as a harsh pesticide to eradicate rats and stray animals in urban areas. Strychnine poisoning is notoriously agonizing. It brutally attacks the central nervous system, causing the victim's back to arch in unnatural convulsive spasms known as opisthotonus, while leaving them entirely conscious and acutely aware of their own suffocation. The horrific scene unfolded rapidly before the helpless, terrified eyes of the Barker family. Despite their frantic efforts to save him and the hurried summoning of local medical assistance, the sheer volume of poison had already overwhelmed the 4-year-old's fragile system. Within mere minutes of taking a bite of the chocolate, Sidney Albert Barker succumbed to the excruciating spasms and passed away. The suddenness and brutality of the tragedy shocked the local community, instantly transforming a place of bright leisure and luxury into a dark scene of incomprehensible grief. An official inquest was swiftly convened to determine how a healthy child could be struck down so suddenly by a simple piece of candy. In the Victorian era, food safety regulations were virtually non-existent, and industrial accidents involving accidental chemical contamination were frighteningly common occurrences. After examining the evidence and the remnants of the sweets, the local coroner and medical experts concluded that the tragedy was a devastating, yet entirely isolated, accident. The official verdict ruled that the strychnine must have accidentally contaminated the chocolate vat during the manufacturing process at J.G. Maynard's factory. It was a highly plausible theory for the time, providing a neat, if tragic, explanation that allowed the authorities to close the book on the child's death without suspecting foul play. However, the nightmare in Brighton was far from over. In the weeks that followed the inquest, the supposed isolated incident rapidly morphed into a widespread, inexplicable terror. Other prominent citizens across the affluent seaside town began falling mysteriously and violently ill. They suffered from severe stomach cramps, muscle rigidity, and acute vomiting. The only connecting thread among these new victims was that they too had recently consumed chocolate creams purchased from J.G. Maynard's shop. A wave of intense panic quickly spread through Victorian high society. The once bustling, beloved confectionery shop became a place of dread, its reputation ruined overnight, and the idyllic resort town was suddenly gripped by the fear of a lethal, random epidemic hiding on its candy shelves. Local investigators scrambled to find the source of what they firmly believed was a catastrophic industrial failure. The police were exclusively looking for an accident in a factory, perhaps a careless worker, a pest control measure gone wrong, or a mislabeled chemical barrel. They had no idea they were actually hunting a heartbroken, middle-aged woman hiding in plain sight. To understand how a lethal poison ended up in a child's holiday candy, we must step away from the tragic victims and examine the mind of the perpetrator. The police were searching for an industrial saboteur or a careless factory worker, but the true culprit was Christiana Edmunds. Born in 1828 into a highly respectable, middle-class family, Christiana spent her early years moving in polite circles. By the late 1860s, she was living with her widowed mother in the fashionable resort town of Brighton. In her early 40s, unmarried, and comfortably supported by a private income, she presented the perfect picture of Victorian gentility. She was considered attractive, sharply intelligent, and entirely unremarkable to the casual observer. But beneath this refined, quiet veneer lay a deeply disturbed psyche, waiting for a specific trigger to unleash its dark potential. That trigger arrived in late 1869 in the form of Dr. Charles Beard. Dr. Beard was a prominent, married local physician who lived near Christiana's residence. What began as a standard doctor-patient relationship quickly morphed into something far more intense on Christiana's part. She began writing him an incessant stream of passionate letters, visiting his home under flimsy medical pretexts, and interpreting his polite, professional bedside manner as a declaration of profound romantic love. Today, modern psychologists recognize this specific obsessive condition as erotomania, a dangerous, unshakable delusion that another person, usually someone of higher social or professional status, is secretly in love with you. In Christiana's fractured reality, Dr. Beard was deeply devoted to her, and the only thing keeping them from a life of happiness was his pre-existing marriage. Eventually, the sheer intensity of her infatuation could no longer be safely ignored. Dr. Beard grew increasingly alarmed by her erratic, persistent behavior and the daily barrage of inappropriate correspondence. Realizing the severe threat to his professional reputation and his family's peace, he took decisive action. In the summer of 1870, Dr. Beard firmly and unequivocally rejected her advances. He demanded that she cease all communication and explicitly forbade her from ever entering his home or speaking to his family again. For a woman consumed by the fires of erotomania, this harsh rejection did not shatter the delusion. It merely shifted the narrative. In her twisted logic, Dr. Beard wasn't rejecting her out of a lack of love. He was simply trapped by his marital obligations. If Dr. Beard was trapped, Christiana coldly concluded that she simply had to remove the trap. His wife, Emily Beard, became the sole obstacle standing in the way of her grand imagined romance. Fueled by this dangerous delusion, Christiana decided to strike. In September of 1870, she visited the Beard household bearing a seemingly innocent, neighborly gift, a box of delicate chocolate creams. She specifically offered one of the sweets to Emily. Shortly after eating the chocolate, Emily became violently ill with severe stomach cramps and nausea. Fortunately, she had spat out the remainder of the bitter-tasting candy, inadvertently saving her own life. She eventually recovered from the violent illness, but the incident sent a chilling shockwave through the household. Dr. Beard immediately suspected foul play. He knew of Christiana's unnatural obsession, her emotional volatility, and the convenient timing of her recent visit. Connecting his wife's sudden illness to the gifted chocolates, he confronted Christiana, angrily accusing her of attempting to poison Emily. But remarkably, he did not go to the police. How could a respected physician allow a known poisoner to walk free? In the rigid, intensely image-conscious world of Victorian high society, a public police scandal involving an obsessed female patient and an alleged poisoning would have utterly destroyed his medical practice and his family's social standing. He chose silence, believing a stern, private warning would be enough to frighten Christiana into backing down forever. It was a perfectly understandable Victorian calculation, yet it would prove to be a fatal mistake that would cost an innocent child his life. Christiana was now backed into a corner. She still desperately wanted Emily Beard dead, but she knew that if Emily suddenly perished from poisoning, Dr. Beard would immediately point the police in her direction. If she couldn't kill Emily directly without raising suspicion, she needed a distraction. She needed an event so massive, so chaotic, and so terrifying that absolutely no one would connect the localized tragedy of the Beard family to a middle-aged spinster with a broken heart. Her solution to this problem was purely diabolical. To execute this terrifying vision, Christiana Edmunds devised a strategy that was both forensically brilliant and unfathomably cruel. She reasoned that if Emily Beard was the sole victim of a sudden poisoning, the authorities would immediately look for a motive, inevitably leading them straight back to the disgraced, obsessive patient. However, if random citizens across the affluent resort town began dropping dead from the exact same cause, Emily's demise would be completely lost in the ensuing chaos. It would no longer look like a targeted assassination. It would look like a catastrophic public health epidemic. To the police and the public, Emily Beard would simply be another unlucky victim of a widespread industrial accident. It was the ultimate psychological cover-up. Her methodology was chillingly methodical. Christiana would stroll into J.G. Maynard's highly respected confectionery shop and purchase several premium boxes of chocolate creams. Returning to the quiet solitude of her middle-class parlor, she seamlessly transformed from a genteel spinster into a meticulous amateur chemist. Using a small pin or a delicate knife, she carefully pierced the outer cocoa shells of the candies and hollowed out a tiny portion of their soft fondant centers. She then filled these empty cavities with lethal, concentrated doses of strychnine. Procuring the deadly toxin in Victorian England was alarmingly simple for a woman of her social standing. She merely visited a local chemist, signed the mandated poison register, and purchased the white powder under the perfectly acceptable guise of needing to eradicate a nuisance of stray cats in her neighborhood. Once the poison was securely inside the chocolates, she expertly smoothed over the shells, leaving virtually no visible trace of tampering. The truly diabolical phase of her plan, however, was the distribution. Christiana could not simply mail the poisoned chocolates to the Beards, as a direct delivery would easily establish a forensic link. Instead, she took the freshly laced boxes right back to J.G. Maynard's shop, relying entirely on her unquestioned status as a refined, respectable lady of the community. She would approach the counter and smoothly request an exchange, claiming she had accidentally purchased the wrong flavor or had simply changed her mind. The unsuspecting clerks, eager to accommodate a wealthy, polite patron, gladly accepted the returned goods. In doing so, they unwittingly took the lethally spiked chocolate creams and placed them right back into the glass display cases, mixing them seamlessly with the general, safe stock. As her twisted campaign escalated, Christiana recognized a glaring vulnerability in her operation. Her frequent, unusual visits to both the local chemist for lethal poisons and the confectioner for constant returns would eventually attract unwanted attention. To completely insulate herself from the physical transactions, she began utilizing proxies. She wandered the busy streets of Brighton, approaching random young errand boys who were playing or looking for odd jobs. For the meager price of a few pennies, she hired these entirely unsuspecting children to act as her intermediaries. They were sent into the shops to purchase the strychnine and the sweets on her behalf, effectively erasing her face from the deadly supply chain and leaving the authorities with descriptions of street urchins rather than a middle-aged woman. Christiana had successfully transformed a beloved local business into an indiscriminate game of Russian roulette. Anyone who walked into Maynard's shop, a visiting aristocrat, a local merchant, or a young mother, was unknowingly playing a lottery with their own life. This ruthless, sweeping strategy was entirely designed to provide a smokescreen for the murder of one specific woman. But the collateral damage was entirely disregarded. It was this exact mechanism of random, cold-blooded distribution that directly led to the tragic demise of 4-year-old Sidney Albert Barker on that fateful summer day. The young boy had simply pulled the wrong chocolate from the wrong box. She had engineered the perfect smokescreen. But like all serial poisoners, her arrogance would soon outpace her caution. The horrific demise of 4-year-old Sidney Barker fundamentally shifted the landscape of the investigation, shattering the illusion of a mere manufacturing error. For Dr. Charles Beard, the news of the child's agonizing public death was a crushing blow of realization. His previous, calculated decision to protect his professional reputation by keeping his patient's sinister obsession a secret had inadvertently paved the way for a random, senseless slaughter. Consumed by profound guilt and dread, the physician finally broke his silence. He presented himself to the local authorities, laying bare the deeply embarrassing details of Christiana's severe erotomania, her relentless stalking behaviors, and the chillingly similar poisoning attempt on his own wife, Emily, just months prior. The narrative of an industrial factory accident instantly evaporated, replaced by the terrifying specter of a deliberate, cold-blooded serial poisoner operating within their own refined social circles. Armed with this explosive revelation, investigators swiftly pivoted their focus from the confectioner's vats to the local pharmacies. They meticulously audited the poison registers of Brighton's chemists, searching for the paper trail of the deadly strychnine. The pieces fell into place with devastating precision, leading the police directly to the doorstep of the unassuming middle-aged spinster. When officers arrived to place Christiana Edmunds under arrest, they were met not with the frantic desperation of a cornered killer, but with the icy, composed arrogance of a privileged aristocrat. She exhibited absolutely no remorse and maintained an unnervingly calm demeanor throughout her apprehension in custody, treating the investigating officers as if they were merely rude tradesmen interrupting her quiet afternoon. The scandalous nature of the crimes. A respectable, wealthy woman indiscriminately poisoning the public to eliminate a romantic rival sparked an absolute frenzy. The local outrage in Brighton was so overwhelmingly intense that authorities feared she could not possibly receive a fair, unbiased hearing in the town she had terrorized. Consequently, the monumental proceedings were relocated to London's most notorious criminal court, the Old Bailey, in January of 1872. It quickly became the definitive media circus of the Victorian era. The public was deeply fascinated and appalled by the stark contradiction of a genteel, well-dressed female poisoner, an archetype that deeply unsettled the strict moral and gender sensibilities of 19th century society. Daily newspaper columns were completely dominated by the trial, drawing massive crowds of spectators eager to catch a glimpse of the infamous chocolate cream killer. Inside the majestic courtroom, the prosecution constructed an inescapable fortress of forensic and circumstantial evidence against her. The most damning testimonies came not from medical experts, but from the impoverished local street boys she had callously hired to run her lethal errands. One by one, the young urchins took the stand, positively identifying the well-dressed woman in the dock as the person who had paid them to purchase the strychnine and return the laced chocolates to Maynard's shop. The local chemist corroborated these accounts, presenting the official poison ledgers bearing the falsified signatures used to acquire the lethal powders. The sheer weight of the calculated premeditation was overwhelming. It took the jury a mere hour of deliberation to see through her aristocratic facade and return a definitive verdict of guilty. The presiding judge, donning the traditional black cap, solemnly sentenced Christiana Edmunds to death by hanging. The gallows were being prepared, and the Victorian public eagerly anticipated the ultimate, grim retribution for the murder of young Sidney Barker. But Christiana Edmunds would never see the executioner's noose. A controversial, desperate legal maneuver was about to change her fate entirely. As the shadow of the gallows loomed ominously over Christiana Edmunds, her defense team launched a desperate 11th-hour campaign to save her from the hangman's rope. They understood that arguing her innocence was entirely futile against the mountain of forensic evidence and eyewitness testimonies. Instead, they pivoted their strategy entirely toward her state of mind. Medical professionals and private investigators dug deeply into the Edmunds family lineage, ultimately uncovering a dark, generational history plagued by severe mental illness. It was revealed that her father had suffered from violent, unmanageable manias, and several of her siblings had also exhibited profound psychological instability throughout their lives. In the eyes of the mid-Victorian legal system, which was just beginning to establish formal frameworks for psychiatric defenses, this undeniable genetic predisposition provided the crucial legal foundation needed to argue that her mind was fundamentally and irrevocably broken, Presented with this compelling psychiatric evidence and a growing public debate over the morality of executing a madwoman, the British Home Secretary officially intervened just days before her scheduled execution. Her death sentence was formally commuted to life imprisonment, and she was ordered to be transferred immediately to the notorious Broadmore Criminal Lunatic Asylum in Berkshire. Opened just a decade prior in 1863, Broadmore was not a conventional penitentiary. It was an imposing, red brick fortress nestled in the English countryside, designed specifically to serve as the final repository for Victorian England's most complex, unpredictable, and high-profile psychological cases. It was a pioneering, yet deeply intimidating, institution meant to permanently house individuals who had committed unspeakable crimes but were deemed legally insane. Monsters the Empire could neither safely release into society nor morally execute on the scaffold. For the vast majority of inmates, a life sentence inside the bleak, high-security walls of a Victorian asylum would represent a miserable, soul-crushing end. Christiana, however, absorbed her new reality with the exact same unnerving, delusional detachment she had displayed during her trial. She would spend the next 35 years walking the highly secured corridors of Broadmore, completely refusing to internalize her status as a condemned child murderer. Instead, she constructed an elaborate aristocratic fantasy for herself. Utilizing her private income, she constantly demanded that her remaining relatives send her expensive clothing, delicate lace, cosmetics, and the absolute latest high society fashions directly from London. She would routinely parade through the stark institutional wards, dressed in elegant, sweeping gowns, treating the grim psychiatric hospital as though it were merely a rustic country retreat where she was enduring a temporary, albeit highly inconvenient, holiday. Most chillingly, the heavy iron doors of Broadmore did absolutely nothing to cure the deep-seated erotomania that had triggered her deadly spree in the first place. Historical medical records and staff diaries from the asylum meticulously documented her ongoing, highly inappropriate behavior toward the male personnel. She constantly sought the undivided attention of the asylum's medical superintendents, writing them suggestive notes and engaging in aggressive, theatrical flirting whenever they conducted their daily rounds of the wards. Her fractured mind continued to misinterpret their professional, mandated psychiatric care as intense romantic devotion, proving that the dangerous, obsessive delusions that nearly wiped out the Beard family were permanently hardwired into her psychology. Insulated from the harsh realities of the outside world and completely shielded from the devastating consequences of her actions, Christiana lived a remarkably long, sheltered life behind those imposing red brick walls. She remained a permanent, eccentric fixture at Broadmore well into the dawn of the 20th century, eventually passing away from natural causes in 1907 at the advanced age of 78. In a profoundly unsettling twist of historical irony, the ruthless chocolate cream killer ended up peacefully outliving almost everyone whose lives she had destroyed or intersected with during her brief reign of terror. The prosecutors, the presiding Old Bailey judge, the tormented Dr. Beard, and the innocent 4-year-old boy she had callously sacrificed to build her smokescreen were all long buried, while the woman who orchestrated the tragedy lived out her final days in quiet, delusional luxury. The chilling legacy of Christiana Edmunds extended far beyond the heavy iron gates and manicured lawns of Broadmore Asylum. In the immediate aftermath of the 1871 Brighton poisonings, A profound and paralyzing paranoia settled over polite Victorian society. Before Christiana engineered her lethal smokescreen, purchasing confectionery from a highly reputable shop like J.G. Maynard's was considered an entirely safe, everyday luxury. She fundamentally changed the way the public viewed commercial food, retail trust, and the receipt of anonymous gifts. Suddenly, a beautifully wrapped box of chocolates arriving unexpectedly in the Morning Post was no longer a delightful surprise. It was viewed as a potential death sentence. Long before the modern, panic-inducing urban legends of razor blades hidden in apples or poisoned Halloween candy terrified suburban parents across the country, there was Christiana Edmunds. The profound difference, of course, is that the nightmare she orchestrated was not a myth born from neighborhood gossip or media hysteria. It was entirely real. Her calculated campaign of terror stripped away the innocence of a simple, sweet treat, leaving a lingering societal anxiety that haunted the public consciousness for decades to come. The story of the aristocratic, impeccably dressed spinster who systematically injected strychnine into chocolate creams became a dark piece of folklore, whispered in parlors and drawing rooms across England. And among those who absorbed this terrifying tale was a young, highly observant girl growing up in the late 19th century. The sheer psychological horror of a seemingly respectable woman using candy as an indiscriminate weapon left an indelible impression on her mind. Decades later, she would channel the ghost of Christiana Edmunds directly into her own world-famous work. That young girl was Agatha Christie. The undisputed queen of mystery would later utilize the exact chilling motif of poisoned chocolates to execute her victims in the acclaimed story, The Mystery of the Spanish Chest. But she wasn't the only literary giant captivated by the Brighton poisonings. The renowned British author Anthony Berkeley directly mirrored Christiana's diabolical smokescreen strategy in his famous 1929 detective novel, The Poisoned Chocolates Case, exploring the precise terror of a killer hiding a targeted murder within a cluster of random poisonings. In fiction, just as in reality, the concept of lethal confections sent anonymously remained a foolproof method to unsettle an audience. Christiana had inadvertently authored a new, terrifying subgenre of the classic British murder mystery. We so often look back at the Victorian era through a lens of romanticized nostalgia, picturing gaslit cobblestone streets, lavish velvet dresses, and strict moral etiquette. Yet, the case of the chocolate cream killer violently shatters that elegant facade. It exposes the terrifying reality of untreated mental illness, the destructive, obsessive power of erotomania, and the sheer lengths to which a desperate stalker will go when a manufactured romantic fantasy is threatened by reality. Christiana Edmunds did not lurk in a dark, foggy alleyway with a bloodied knife, waiting to strike down her perceived enemies. Instead, she operated in broad daylight, wearing the respectable garments of the middle class, hiding behind a polite smile and a silk veil. Her chosen weapon was the ultimate symbol of love, comfort, and childhood innocence. By corrupting something so inherently sweet, she committed a crime that felt deeply, unforgivably intimate to the public. She proved that the most dangerous monsters don't always hide in the shadows of the criminal underworld. Sometimes, they smile at you from across a pastry counter. Have you ever accepted a sweet treat from a stranger? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this deep dive into historical true crime, please like, subscribe, and until next time, stay safe.